January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains over the skeletal remains of what had once been called Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann crouched in a shallow foxhole, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the frozen air. Around him, the forest whispered with the ghosts of 30,000 German casualties. His uniform, once the proud field grey of the Wehrmacht, hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds in 6 weeks. The K-98 rifle in his hands felt heavier than it should have. Not because of its weight, but because there were only 3 rounds left in his ammunition pouch. Across the snow-covered ridge, barely visible through the morning mist, American positions hummed with a sound that Hartmann had come to recognize with a mixture of awe and dread. It was not the sound of artillery or tank engines. It was something far more terrifying, the steady, mechanical rhythm of supply trucks arriving in endless procession. Even from a kilometer away, he could hear them, the rumble of deuce-and-a-halfs, the grinding of gears, the shouts of teamsters unloading crate after crate of ammunition, food, fuel, medicine. The Americans had been pushed back here, bloodied, surprised by the German offensive. Yet somehow, impossibly, their supply lines had never broken. Hartmann reached into his tunic and withdrew his last possession of value, a tin of ersatz coffee, the bitter acorn substitute that barely resembled the real thing. He had been saving it for 3 days. As he fumbled with numb fingers to open it, a sudden wind carried a scent across no man's land. Real coffee. American coffee. Rich, dark, unmistakable. Somewhere in those enemy lines, men were brewing fresh pots as casually as if they were at a cafe in Kansas. Hartmann closed his eyes. In that moment, he understood something his generals had refused to acknowledge. Germany had not lost this war on the battlefield. They had lost it in the factories, the rail yards, the shipping lanes, and the supply depots of a nation that could deliver hot coffee to the front lines of a winter offensive in a foreign land. The true superweapon of the Second World War was never a secret rocket or a wonder tank. It was a system so vast, so efficient, so overwhelmingly abundant that it crushed the Axis powers beneath an avalanche of material they could neither match nor comprehend. This is the story of how the German Reich, and later Imperial Japan, discovered too late that they were not fighting an army. They were fighting an industrial colossus whose logistical capability represented a revolution in warfare itself. In the summer of 1940, as German panzers rolled through France and Wehrmacht soldiers celebrated their swift victory over what had been considered Europe's finest army, a peculiar confidence settled over the Reich. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, had reason for optimism. Their military doctrine, centered on Bugungskrieg, or maneuver warfare, had proven devastatingly effective. The concept was elegant: concentrate overwhelming force at a single point, break through enemy lines, and exploit the breach before the opponent could react. Speed, aggression, and tactical brilliance had compensated for Germany's material disadvantages. Why burden your forces with elaborate supply chains when victory could be achieved in weeks? This philosophy was born from necessity as much as innovation. Germany's economy, even at the height of its power, could not sustain prolonged material competition with the great industrial powers. The nation imported 85% of its oil, 70% of its copper, and significant portions of its rubber and tungsten. The Treaty of Versailles had systematically dismantled much of Germany's heavy industrial capacity after the First World War. What remained was impressive by European standards but fundamentally limited. The German solution was to make war swift and decisive, to win before logistics became a factor. And for a time, it worked brilliantly. Poland fell in 5 weeks. Denmark collapsed in 6 hours. Norway, despite British intervention, was conquered in 2 months. France, the great fortress of Europe, surrendered in 6 weeks. By June 1940, the Wehrmacht stood supreme. From the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union, German power seemed unchallengeable. In this moment of triumph, the notion that logistics could decide the outcome of modern warfare seemed absurd, a concern for lesser nations, not for the master strategists of the Third Reich. But across the Atlantic Ocean, a different kind of war machine was stirring. When President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress in January 1941, nearly a year before Pearl Harbor would drag America into the conflict, he spoke of making the United States the arsenal of democracy. It was not mere rhetoric. Roosevelt and his advisers had studied the lessons of the Great War, where American industrial intervention had tipped the scales. They understood something fundamental. Modern warfare was as much about production capacity as tactical genius. Perhaps more so. The numbers that would emerge from American factories over the next 4 years are almost difficult to believe, even in historical retrospect. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States would produce 297,000 aircraft. Germany, by comparison, managed 119,000. American shipyards launched 2,710 Liberty ships alone, mass-produced cargo vessels built with such efficiency that the record for construction time stood at just 4 days and 15 hours. The U.S. manufactured 86,000 tanks, while Germany produced 46,000. American industry delivered 2.4 million trucks and 11,000 railway locomotives. But these raw numbers, staggering as they are, tell only part of the story. What truly differentiated American logistics was not just quantity, but systematic thinking on a scale never before attempted in human history. The United States didn't simply build weapons and supplies, it built the entire infrastructure to deliver them anywhere on Earth, maintain them, and keep them operational. This was the invisible superweapon that German commanders would slowly, agonizingly, come to recognize as insurmountable. June 22, 1941. The Soviet-German border. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, architect of German armored doctrine and commander of Panzergruppe II, watched his tank columns roll eastward into the Soviet Union with the confidence of a man who had already conquered a continent. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history, had commenced at dawn. Over 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, and 3,600 tanks surged across the frontier. The objective was audacious: destroy the Red Army in a matter of weeks, capture Moscow before winter, and secure the resources of the Soviet Union for the Reich. Guderian's supply situation at the start of Barbarossa was, by German standards, adequate. His panzer divisions carried enough fuel and ammunition for several weeks of intensive combat. The Wehrmacht had stockpiled supplies along the border. Horse-drawn wagons, over 600,000 horses accompanied the invasion, would handle local distribution. The railroad system, once captured from the Soviets and converted to German gauge, would maintain the long supply lines. On paper, it seemed manageable. Within 6 weeks, the system began to fracture. The vast distances of Russia, something no German staff officer had truly appreciated from studying maps in Berlin, devoured supplies at catastrophic rates. A German panzer division required 30,000 gallons of fuel per day to maintain offensive operations. Guderian's Panzergruppe contained approximately 24 divisions. The mathematics were brutal. His forces consumed roughly 750,000 gallons of fuel daily, not counting the requirements of infantry divisions, air support, and logistics vehicles themselves. The distance from the German border to Moscow exceeded 1,000 kilometers. The railroads, destroyed by retreating Soviets, took weeks to repair and convert. The Russian dirt roads, turned to bottomless mud by autumn rains, swallowed trucks and wagons. By September, German forces that had expected to parade through Moscow were stalling, not from Soviet resistance alone, but from simple lack of fuel and ammunition. Guderian wrote in his diary that month, his earlier confidence eroding, "The supply situation is becoming catastrophic. We advance not by operational plan, but by whatever fuel we can scrape together." His tanks, the finest in the world by ton-to-ton comparison, sat immobile for lack of gasoline. His troops, veterans of Poland and France, waited for ammunition that sat in rail yards 300 kilometers behind the front. The swift, decisive victory that German doctrine demanded was slipping away, strangled by the tyranny of distance and the limitations of horse-drawn logistics in the 20th century. Yet even as German supply lines stretched to breaking, German intelligence officers noted something curious. American supplies had begun arriving in Soviet ports: Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, Vladivostok. Under the Lend-Lease program, signed into law in March 1941, the United States was extending material support to Britain and, after the German invasion, to the Soviet Union. Initially, the Germans dismissed this as insignificant. How much could American aid truly matter? The Soviets would collapse before American factories could make a difference. They were catastrophically wrong. Over the course of the war, the United States would deliver to the Soviet Union 400,000 trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, 1.75 million tons of food, and vast quantities of industrial equipment, raw materials, and, critically, aviation fuel. These supplies arrived via 3 routes: the Arctic convoys braving German U-boats to reach Murmansk, the Persian corridor through Iran, and the Pacific route through Vladivostok. The logistical complexity of delivering material across thousands of miles of hostile territory, through submarine-infested waters, and into the hands of a military whose language few Americans spoke, was staggering. Yet it worked. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov would later acknowledge, "Without American production, the Soviet Union could not have survived the war." Nikita Khrushchev was more direct. "Stalin admitted that without American trucks, we would have lost the war." The irony was acute. Germany, which prided itself on efficiency and organization, was being outmaneuvered not by Soviet tactical brilliance alone, but by American logistical capability funneled through Soviet hands. November 1942. North Africa. Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, sat in his command vehicle outside El Alamein, studying supply reports that read like a death sentence. His Afrika Korps had fought brilliantly for 18 months, turning the North African campaign into a legend of armored warfare. But brilliance could not conjure fuel from sand. Rommel's forces required 30,000 tons of supplies per month to maintain offensive capability. In October 1942, they received less than 8,000 tons. British submarines and aircraft, operating from Malta, had devastated Italian convoys crossing the Mediterranean. Of the supplies that did reach North African ports, much was lost to Allied bombing or the sheer difficulty of transporting it across hundreds of miles of desert. Rommel's tanks, when they had fuel, were superior to most British armor. His troops were experienced and motivated. His tactical sense was perhaps unmatched in the war. None of it mattered. Across the line, British and Commonwealth forces under General Bernard Montgomery were accumulating a staggering material advantage. And behind them, growing stronger each day, was an American presence that Rommel's intelligence officers struggled to comprehend. The American supply buildup for Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, had begun months earlier. Unlike the German approach of stockpiling whatever could be scrounged, the American system was methodical and overwhelming. Entire task forces were organized around logistics. Supply ships departed American ports loaded not just with weapons and ammunition, but with spare parts cataloged by serial number, medical supplies sufficient for projected casualties, fuel reserves calculated for specific operational plans, and even specialized vehicles designed for desert conditions. When American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942, they brought with them something unprecedented: mobile supply depots that could be established and operational within hours. These weren't simple ammunition dumps. They were systematized distribution centers, organized using principles borrowed from American retail and manufacturing. Every item had a stock number. Every requisition followed a standardized procedure. There were dedicated units whose entire purpose was to manage supply flow, equipped with typewriters, filing systems, and eventually, improbably, primitive computers to track inventory. A German quartermaster officer, captured after the fall of Tunisia in May 1943, was interrogated by American Logistics Corps personnel. His testimony, preserved in U.S. Army archives, reveals the psychological impact of facing this system. "We calculated requirements for ammunition based on expected combat intensity. You seem to calculate based on unlimited availability. Your soldiers fired mortars like we fired rifles, not because they were profligate, but because they could. There was always more. We could hear your supply convoys at night. They never stopped. We couldn't understand where it all came from." Where it came from was a supply chain that stretched back across the Atlantic to American ports, to railway networks moving goods from factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles, to dockyards where Liberty ships were being launched faster than Germany could sink them. The distance from New York to Casablanca exceeds 3,000 nautical miles. The United States was maintaining offensive operations at the end of a supply line that would have broken any European power, and they were doing it while simultaneously supplying Britain, supporting the Soviet Union, and preparing for a campaign in the Pacific theater. Rommel, a soldier who understood logistics as well as any German commander, wrote to his wife in February 1943, "The material superiority of the enemy is crushing. Our position is untenable." He was not speaking primarily of tanks or aircraft. He was speaking of the endless stream of supplies that allowed the Allies to replace losses faster than he could inflict them. A destroyed British tank was replaced within days. A lost German panzer might never be replaced. This was not warfare as the Wehrmacht understood it. This was industrial attrition on a global scale. By 1943, German military intelligence had accumulated enough data to construct a terrifying picture. The United States, in addition to maintaining its civilian economy at near full capacity, was outproducing the entire Axis combined. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, presented Hitler with analyses showing that American steel production exceeded German output by nearly 4-to-1. Aluminum production was even more lopsided. American shipyards were launching cargo vessels faster than German U-boats could destroy them. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. But numbers on a spreadsheet, however daunting, still seemed abstract to German field commanders. The true nature of American logistical superiority would become viscerally, undeniably clear only when German soldiers encountered it directly. That encounter came in the summer of 1944, when the Western Allies returned to France. June 6, 1944. Normandy. The invasion of Normandy was, in military terms, the most complex logistical operation ever attempted. Moving 156,000 soldiers across the English Channel in a single day required 7,000 vessels and 11,000 aircraft. But the landing was only the beginning. The true challenge was sustaining those forces in combat against a German army that, even in decline, remained formidable. The Allied solution was Operation Mulberry, artificial harbors constructed in England, towed across the Channel, and assembled on the Normandy coast. Within weeks, these temporary ports were handling more tonnage than most permanent facilities. By the end of June, the Allies were landing 20,000 tons of supplies daily. By August, that figure reached 30,000 tons. In addition, Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, was laid beneath the Channel, pumping fuel directly to France. This was logistics as engineering miracle, the transformation of the coastline itself into a supply artery. German commanders watching this unfold struggled to formulate a response. General Feld Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, remarked to his staff, "We are not fighting against soldiers. We are fighting against machines, against a system that seems to have no limits." His counterattack plans repeatedly foundered not on Allied tactical superiority, but on the simple fact that his divisions lacked the fuel to reach attack positions. The Allies could afford to make mistakes, to absorb casualties, to launch failed attacks, because their supply system could replace losses. Germany could afford none of these things. A Waffen-SS officer, captured during the fighting in the Falaise pocket in August 1944, provided testimony that captures the psychological impact of this disparity. He had been part of an elite panzer division, theoretically among the best-equipped forces in the German military. His account, recorded by U.S. Army intelligence, is striking. On the second day of the encirclement, we ran out of fuel. On the third day, we were rationing ammunition. On the fourth day, we were eating the last of our field rations. We could see your positions from our trapped columns. Your men were eating from tins of meat, smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee. Real coffee. At night, your generators ran continuously, powering lights, radios, medical equipment. You had trucks moving supplies forward even under artillery fire. We understood then that we were not just losing a battle. We had already lost the war. We just hadn't admitted it yet. This testimony contains a recurring theme that appears throughout German accounts of the later war period: food. It seems almost trivial compared to discussions of tanks and aircraft, yet the symbolic power of food, specifically the abundance and quality of American rations, had profound psychological effects on enemy soldiers. The German diet, by 1944, had deteriorated severely. Ersatz substitutes replaced real coffee, real chocolate, real tobacco. Meat was scarce. Frontline rations were monotonous and insufficient. Soldiers went hungry regularly. American forces, by contrast, ate better in combat zones than many German civilians ate at home. The U.S. military logistics system delivered not just calories, but variety. K-rations, C-rations, and D-rations were scientifically formulated for nutrition. They included candy bars, coffee, cigarettes, and canned goods that German soldiers viewed with astonishment when they overran American positions or captured supply dumps. A chocolate bar, in the hands of a starving German soldier, became more than sustenance. It became a symbol of the vast gulf in national capacity. In the archives of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, there exists a photograph taken in September 1944, after the liberation of France. It shows German prisoners of war being fed by American military police. The POWs are eating white bread, meat, and vegetables, a meal superior to what they had received from their own army in weeks. The expressions on their faces reflect not just gratitude, but a kind of ideological confusion. They had been taught that Germany represented the pinnacle of European civilization, that the Reich would establish a new order. Instead, they were being fed by what Nazi propaganda had dismissed as a mongrel democracy, and the food was better than anything they had tasted in years. December 1944. The Ardennes. Hitler's decision to launch a winter offensive through the Ardennes forest was born from desperation cloaked as strategic vision. The plan, to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West, was audacious to the point of delusion. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht understood the logistical problems immediately. The offensive required fuel stockpiles that Germany no longer possessed. Hitler's response was chilling in its simplicity: capture American fuel dumps. The offensive would sustain itself with enemy supplies. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and the hope that American forces would collapse under a determined assault, as French forces had in 1940. It was a plan built on memories of past victories rather than current realities. When the offensive began on December 16, 1944, German forces achieved tactical surprise and early success. Some American units broke. Others fought with desperate determination. The battle became the largest and bloodiest fought by American forces in the European theater. But the defining characteristic of the Battle of the Bulge was not tactical, it was logistical. As German columns advanced, they discovered abandoned American supply depots. What they found stunned them. Mountains of ammunition, neatly stacked and catalogued. Fuel dumps with thousands of gallons of gasoline. Warehouses filled with food, winter clothing, medical supplies. And yet, despite these captures, German forces ran out of fuel within days. The distances were too great, the consumption too high, and, most critically, the American supply system proved impossible to break. At the town of Bastogne, the American 101st Airborne Division was encircled by German forces. The conventional military wisdom suggested that surrounded troops, cut off from supply, would quickly be forced to surrender. Instead, American transport aircraft began dropping supplies by parachute. Over the course of a week, C-47 transport planes delivered hundreds of tons of ammunition, food, and medical supplies directly to the surrounded garrison. The Germans, who had been unable to maintain air superiority or conduct effective aerial resupply for years, could only watch in frustration. This was the moment when many German soldiers experienced a final collapse of confidence in victory. They had been told for years that the Reich possessed superior technology, superior organization, superior will. Yet here, surrounded and under siege, American forces were being sustained from the air with a casualness that suggested unlimited resources. Meanwhile, German troops attacking Bastogne were rationing their last shells, scrounging fuel from destroyed vehicles, and going hungry. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, the officer we encountered in the opening scene, survived the Battle of the Bulge. He was captured by American forces in January 1945. In his interrogation, preserved in the National Archives, he made a statement that echoes through thousands of similar testimonies. "I realized we had lost the war the first time I smelled real coffee from your lines. Not because of the coffee itself, but because of what it represented. You could ship fresh coffee beans across an ocean, transport them hundreds of miles through winter conditions, and distribute them to frontline troops in the middle of battle. If you could do that with coffee, what couldn't you do? We were fighting a nation that could afford to care about the morale value of hot coffee in a foxhole. We couldn't afford to care about anything except survival." The symbolic weight of coffee, that single commodity, became a recurring theme in German accounts of American abundance. It appeared in letters, in diaries, in post-war testimonies. Coffee represented civilization, normalcy, abundance. It was a luxury that separated mere survival from comfortable living. The fact that American soldiers had ready access to it in combat conditions spoke to an industrial capacity so vast that it could attend to the psychological comfort of its troops even while waging war on a global scale. March 1945. The Rhine River. When Allied forces reached the Rhine in March 1945, they faced Germany's last major natural barrier. The river was wide, fast-flowing, and defended by whatever forces the Wehrmacht could scrape together. German military theory held that crossing a river of this magnitude under fire would require weeks of preparation and cost thousands of casualties. The Allies crossed in multiple locations simultaneously, constructing pontoon bridges under fire, and within days had established unshakable footholds on the eastern bank. The speed of this operation astonished German defenders. What they couldn't see were the stockpiles of bridging equipment, the specialized engineer units trained specifically for river crossings, the prepositioned supplies of everything from pontoons to steel cables. American logistics had not simply accumulated the materials needed for a river crossing, they had systematized the entire process, reducing it to a repeatable procedure that could be executed simultaneously at multiple points. A German engineer officer, captured during the Rhine crossing, was interrogated about his assessment of Allied capabilities. His response, recorded in U.S. Army intelligence reports, is illuminating: "We expected you to pause at the Rhine. Rivers of this size are major obstacles. We anticipated weeks to prepare our defenses. Instead, you crossed as if it were a minor inconvenience. You built bridges faster than we could destroy them. You had specialized vehicles we had never seen, amphibious trucks, swimming tanks, portable bridges. But more than the equipment, it was the organization. Every unit seemed to know its role. Supplies appeared where needed without apparent delay. It was like watching a factory production line, except the product was military force, and the assembly line was a battlefield." This industrial approach to warfare, the application of mass production principles to military operations, was perhaps America's most fundamental innovation. The United States had not simply outproduced Germany, it had reconceptualized what logistics meant. War was not an exceptional state requiring improvisation and heroism at every level. War was a problem of industrial engineering, to be solved through systematic planning, standardization, and the application of overwhelming resources. By April 1945, as Allied forces drove into the heart of Germany, the contrast between German and American supply situations had reached almost absurd proportions. German cities were starving. The railway network was shattered. What remained of the Wehrmacht was being supplied by horse-drawn carts and civilian vehicles burning wood gas. Meanwhile, American forces advancing through Germany had access to hot showers, fresh uniforms, USO entertainment, and 3 solid meals a day. German civilians, watching American troops enter their towns, were confronted with a cognitive dissonance that propaganda could no longer explain away. These were supposed to be the inferior forces of a decadent democracy. Instead, they were well-fed, well-equipped, and supported by a logistical apparatus that seemed to defy the very concept of scarcity. Summer 1945. The Pacific Theater. While Germany's defeat was being sealed by Allied logistics in Europe, Imperial Japan was learning the same bitter lesson across the Pacific. The Japanese military had entered the war with a fundamentally different strategic calculation than Germany. Japan's leadership understood from the beginning that they could not match American industrial capacity. Their strategy depended on a swift, decisive campaign that would secure resource-rich territories, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, and create a defensive perimeter so costly to breach that America would seek a negotiated peace. This strategy was not entirely irrational. The vast distances of the Pacific Ocean seemed to favor defense. Japan's island possessions could be fortified into unsinkable aircraft carriers. The Imperial Navy was formidable. Japanese troops had proven their willingness to fight to the death. The calculation was that American resolve would break against the costs of a prolonged Pacific campaign. What Japanese planners failed to anticipate was that American logistics would transform the Pacific Ocean from an impassable barrier into a highway. The United States created a mobile logistics system that could sustain offensive operations across thousands of miles of open water. Fleet trains, groups of supply ships accompanying naval task forces, kept warships at sea for months without returning to port. Mobile repair ships could fix damaged vessels in forward anchorages. Hospital ships provided advanced medical care in combat zones. Most remarkably, the U.S. Navy developed underway replenishment to a fine art, allowing ships to take on fuel, ammunition, and supplies while maintaining speed and formation. The statistics of this system are staggering. By 1944, the U.S. Navy's Service Squadron 10, the logistical formation supporting the Pacific Fleet, included over 400 ships, tankers, ammunition ships, supply vessels, repair ships, hospital ships, and tenders. This was a floating industrial base capable of sustaining a fleet larger than most nations' entire navies. Service Squadron 10 was not simply support, it was the foundation upon which American Pacific strategy was built. Japanese officers who survived the war and participated in post-war debriefings consistently expressed shock at American logistical capabilities. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, one of the architects of kamikaze tactics, stated in 1945, "We calculated that America would need years to recover from Pearl Harbor and project power across the Pacific. Instead, within 18 months, you were conducting offensive operations simultaneously at multiple points across a front thousands of miles wide. We could not comprehend how this was possible. Our logistics doctrine assumed that forces operating far from bases would inevitably weaken. Yours seemed to grow stronger." The contrast was perhaps most visible in the island-hopping campaigns. When American forces invaded a Pacific island, they arrived with overwhelming firepower, but also with a supply train that would have seemed fantastic to previous generations of soldiers. Pre-invasion bombardments expended ammunition on a scale that Japanese defenders found incomprehensible, not because American commanders were wasteful, but because they could afford to use firepower to save lives. After the landing, Seabee construction battalions, naval engineers, would transform captured islands into forward bases with startling speed. Airstrips, supply depots, fuel storage, port facilities, all constructed with prefabricated materials and standardized plans that could be executed in weeks. Japanese troops, isolated in Pacific garrisons, faced a different reality. Supply convoys from Japan were increasingly destroyed by American submarines. Even when supplies got through, they were insufficient. Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands faced starvation. Their diaries, recovered after the war, make heartbreaking reading. Men reduced to eating grass, rats, anything to survive. They watched American aircraft fly over with impunity, knowing that those planes were maintained by spare parts delivered across thousands of miles of ocean, fueled by tankers that sailed unmolested, flown by pilots who ate 3 meals a day. The symbolic food item for Pacific Theater Japanese soldiers was not coffee, but Spam, the canned meat that became ubiquitous in American military rations. Captured Japanese soldiers encountered Spam in American mess halls and were astounded by its availability. To men who had been subsisting on rice and whatever could be foraged, the idea that Americans considered Spam unremarkable, even complained about it, spoke to an abundance that seemed almost insulting. How wealthy must a nation be, Japanese POWs wondered, that its soldiers took unlimited meat for granted? August 1945. The end. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally ended the Pacific War, but Imperial Japan had been defeated logistically long before those terrible weapons fell. By the summer of 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been virtually annihilated. American submarines and aircraft had severed the supply lines connecting the home islands to occupied territories. Japan was being starved of oil, rubber, food, and raw materials. The industrial capacity to continue the war had been strangled not by invasion, but by the systematic destruction of Japan's logistical network. Post-war analyses would reveal that America's logistical superiority had multiple foundations. The most obvious was raw industrial capacity, a manufacturing base that dwarfed all other nations. But equally important was systematic thinking. The United States approached logistics as a science, not an art. During the war, American universities conducted studies on optimal supply chain design. Operations research, a field that would transform business in the post-war era, emerged from military logistics problems. The U.S. military developed standardized procedures for everything from loading ships to distributing ammunition. They created specialized units and trained officers specifically in logistics, treating it as a professional discipline equal to tactical command. Perhaps most critically, American logistics was enabled by geography and economy. The United States possessed the world's largest railroad network, which moved goods from factories to ports with efficiency no European nation could match. American ports could load and unload cargo at rates that exceeded European and Asian facilities by orders of magnitude. The domestic economy was so large that military production, though enormous, represented only a fraction of total industrial capacity. America could wage total war and simultaneously raise civilian living standards, a feat literally impossible for Germany or Japan. Years later. Reflection. In the decades following World War II, as historians sifted through archives and interviewed survivors, a consensus emerged about why the Axis powers lost. Superior Allied tactics played a role. Strategic mistakes by Hitler and his generals contributed. The courage of resistance movements mattered. But underlying all of it, enabling all of it, was a logistical superiority so complete that the war's outcome was arguably inevitable once America entered the conflict. German and Japanese military leaders, reflecting in captivity, returned again and again to the same themes. They had not understood the nature of industrial warfare. They had believed that will, discipline, and tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantage. They had assumed that warfare was fundamentally about soldiers and weapons, when in fact modern warfare was about systems, the vast, unglamorous networks of supply that kept soldiers fed, vehicles fueled, and weapons supplied. The coffee that Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann smelled across no man's land in the Ardennes was never just coffee. It was a symbol of a nation that could fight on multiple continents simultaneously while maintaining quality of life for its troops. It represented a logistical system that treated morale as seriously as ammunition expenditure. It embodied an industrial capacity that could attend to details because the fundamentals were so overwhelmingly secure. In the archives of the United States Military Academy at West Point, there is a document prepared in 1946 by a commission studying lessons from the war. One passage stands out: the American victory was won not in the dramatic moments of battle, but in the decisions made in Detroit factories, in the loading docks of New York Harbor, in the railroad yards of Chicago. It was won by quartermasters and logistics officers whose names will never be known to history. It was won by a system that transformed American economic might into military capability with unprecedented efficiency. Future adversaries must understand, America's true superweapon is not any single technology, but the capacity to sustain operations at a scale and duration that renders eventual victory mathematically certain. This was the lesson that Germany and Japan learned too late. They had prepared to fight a war of maneuver and decisive battles. They found themselves in a war of attrition against an opponent who could afford to lose every battle and still win the war. They had optimized for tactical brilliance when strategic abundance was what mattered. They had celebrated the lightning strike while failing to respect the gathering storm. On that frozen morning in the Ardennes forest, as Friedrich Hartmann smelled the coffee and understood his nation's defeat, he experienced what thousands of Axis soldiers would come to recognize. The war was not being lost because German soldiers lacked courage, or Japanese pilots lacked skill, or Axis commanders lacked intelligence. It was being lost because they were fighting an industrial colossus whose logistical capabilities represented a revolution in human organizational capacity. They were fighting a nation that could deliver hot coffee to a foxhole in Belgium in the middle of winter, and that coffee, humble, ordinary, easily overlooked, was the signature of a power that could not be defeated by any force their military traditions understood. The trucks kept rumbling through the night, bringing supplies forward. They rumbled through France, through the Philippines, through the Pacific Islands, across North Africa, into Germany itself. They rumbled with a mechanical persistence that ground down Axis resistance not through dramatic assaults but through simple, inexorable pressure. This was America's superweapon, not a wonder weapon, not a secret technology, but a system so vast and efficient that it made victory not just possible, but inevitable. And by the time the Axis powers understood this, understood that they were not fighting an army but an industrial system of unprecedented power, it was far, far too late. The war had already been won in the factories, the rail yards, and the shipping lanes. The battles were just mathematics working itself out across geography and time, with an outcome as certain as the rising sun. The logistics had spoken, and their verdict was final.